want to start today with the United Nations organizations. Obviously, we have all these organizations in which Nigeria is part and parcel of. But first, what do we call the United Nations organization? It is an organization perhaps known to be the biggest or the largest of all international organizations we have in the world or globally. Now, Nigeria specifically joined the United Nations organizations, signed to becoming a member, as a 99th member, immediately after independence in 1960. Well, let's look at the history, the genesis and the chronicles, okay, that guides that we can talk about as far as the international organization called the United Nations is concerned. Now, when you look at this now, the United Nations organizations cannot but to be talked about, tracing it as far as back as the League of Nations. In 1914, there was a global war known as the World War I that broke out in Europe. And with this, we had a lot of European countries participating in the war, the Greco-Hungarian War. And this drew a lot of allies together, okay, countries warring at each other, having, to choose sides. Do you understand now? So it lasted till 1919. So there was a League of Nations that was set up after the First World War. Now, when the First World War ended, in 1919, the League of Nations was set up. Now, the League of Nations was supposed to be an international body that would prevent the outbreak of another world war. Now, let's quickly look into the League of Nations, the aims and objectives of the League of Nations, the reasons or the aims of the League. Number one, to prevent another occurrence of the global war. Okay? Not only that, to promote peace globally. And again, another aims and objective of the United Nations, the League of Nations, is to respect the sovereignty of most of these countries. And if you can see, we talk about maintaining and respecting the sovereignty of nations. Not only that, to promote the socio-cultural cooperation among member nations, and not only that, to find common ground to improve the fundamental human rights of member nations. Now, note this very well. Many of us, we know, or we agree with me, that we have agencies of the United Nations. And one of the agencies of the United Nations is the ILO, the International Labour Organization. The International Labour Organization was established during the Geneva Convention in 1919, and it was one of the agencies of the League of Nations. But unfortunately, the League of Nations could not hold its own. And let's quickly look at the pitfalls, the deficiencies, or the reasons for the fall or the failure of the League of Nations. Number one, we said that it was not global enough as its members were restricted to European countries alone. Believe it or not, the League of Nations was not globally represented because we never had African countries there, we never had Asian countries there, we never had Oceanian countries, not even to talk about the South Americans and the North American countries. So it was a group of European countries coming together to form what we call the League of Nations. Not only that, their meetings were poorly attended, were irregular, and even the resolutions being made were not binding in some cases. So these were strong deficiencies that hit hard of the League of Nations and could not make it to survive its own. Now let's also look at all the things. Okay, it's lacked the standing army to mediate during conflicts. And you can see now that in the Congo War, which I told you about in the previous classes, that the first international peacekeeping operation Nigeria participated in was the Congo War in 1961. Are we there now? In 1961. So it was the existence of the United Nations peacekeeping operation with Nigeria joined and all the countries that contributed their military into the mediating role. Then, of course, the League of Nations never had opportunity to create this. Then we also talk about the exclusion of the Germans. Of course, the Germans were defeated in the First World War, and because of this, they were excluded from the charter that was signed, and later on they felt okay, they extended a letter to them to admit them into the forum. But this was seen as an embarrassment to the Germans, and they failed to be part of it. But let's not forget that not all the European countries were part of the League of Nations. And finally, what actually came, okay, that nailed the coffin of the League of Nations was that it was not capable enough to prevent the outbreak of the Second World War. Today, as we speak, people have been talking about the outbreak of the Third World War because of the war going on between Ukraine and Russia. Okay? And we're talking about NATO joining it, and when NATO joins, or the American joins, it's going to be a global conflict. And when it has to do with global conflict, we're going to be having people that will choose sides. Alright, but let's look at the Second World War now. When you talk about the Second World War, the outbreak of the Second World War came about between 1939 and 1945. In the 20s, the Nazis government, there was a Nazi movement that was led by Adolf Hitler. It was a social worker party that was led by Adolf Hitler. And Nazism actually means, okay, the superiority of the German race over every other race, which means that it is a notion that sees the Germans to be superior than every other person. So there was a fascist state that was actually created by Benito Mussolini's government in the 30s, precisely in 1932. Are we there now? So both the fascist government and the Nazi government became allies, and the Germans decided to invade Poland. All right. After invading Poland, they invaded Austria. On a pretext that the Polish government or the Polish soldiers shot the German soldiers. So that actually was a playbook or a pretext to invade Poland and Austria. Because of this, are we there now? The British government and France stood up to go against the aggression of the Germans. And we can see that both the fascist government of Italy under Benito Mussolini and also under Adolf Hitler of Germany, the Nazis, became an axis. Are we there now? So it was a war between the Axis and the Allies. Who were the Axis? In Europe, we had what? Italy. We had Germany. And in Asia, we have Japan. And Japan in Asia. Who are the Allies? We're talking about the British, the French, the Americans, the Canadians, and the USSR, the Soviet Union. But unfortunately, they were allies. But after the World War II, they became enemies. We're going to be talking about in subsequent words, in subsequent lessons. I will tell you. So the World War II broke out, and so it drew the end of the League of Nations. Like I said here, I said it was fought from two fronts, Europe and Asia. I will tell you. Do we understand now? So in Asia country, the Japanese were invading other countries like China and also part of Russia, and also other countries like South Korea and the Indian Ocean, the Asian countries, the Pacific countries specifically. I would know. So because that place is called the Pacific Ocean, so we're talking about the Pacific countries. Do you understand that? So the Americans were not initially into the war, but people believe that there was a declassified document that drew the Americans into the war, that the Pearl Harbor bombing of their ship was not done by the Japanese after all, that it was a pretext by the Americans to enter into the war. Whatever it takes, okay, whatever it means, okay, Hideto Hirohito surrendered in August 26 after the Americans tested an atomic bomb, okay, that was dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so it was that the World War II ended in Asia. Okay, it had originally ended earlier than that in January 1945 when the Germans surrendered to the Soviet government. The USSR, the Soviet Union, were the ones that actually won the war, mostly in Europe. All right. So let's now look at, during the war, we had the Tehran Conference, the London Declaration, I beg your pardon, first in 1941, whereby some world leaders were coming together. We had the Atlantic Charter of 1942, we had the Moscow Conference in 1943, we had the Tehran Conference in 1944, we had the Darlington Oak Conference in 1944 as well. But unfortunately, okay, in 1945, October 24, 1945, at a place called Lake Success in San Francisco, United States of America, the United Nations Organization was formed. Are we there now? The charter was signed by 5 countries. We have the United States of America, United States, USA, we have Britain, we have France, we have the USSR, and China. So these 5 countries that signed the charter also became what? Became the 5 permanent members that we have, the 5 Ps that we have in the United Nations Security Council. Are we there now? Now, what are the aims and objectives of the United Nations? The aims and objectives of the United Nations were similar, or are still similar to that of the League of Nations: promoting global peace, prevention of war, promoting the rights, the social rights, and the economic rights, and also the fundamental human rights of citizens, promoting socio-cultural and cooperation amongst countries, defending sovereignty of nations, respecting sovereignty of nations, and the what more. Are we there now? Now, the United Nations, okay, we can say that it has 6 organs. There is no country that its government do not have organs, the machineries to which they operate. Nigeria has a stereotype. We have the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. These are the main organs in Nigeria that runs the government, that wheels, that pivots the government. So also the international organizations, stereotyping the United Nations, also have what? 8 own organs. It has 6 organs. We have the General Assembly, we have the Security Council, we have the Economic and Social Council called ECOWAS, we have the Trusteeship Council, we have the International Court of Justice, as well as we have what we call the Secretariats. Now let's going to pick them one after the other, because the next class we're going to give you notes to write for the explanation what's more. Are we there now? Now let's start with the General Assembly. The General Assembly comprises of all member nations. All member nations are represented in the General Assembly. One of the major objectives of the General Assembly is to decide on issues and pass resolutions. Are we there now? They deliberate on issues. Are we there? So most of the things they do, okay, are being ratified by them. Should the Security Council nominate someone for a post, the General Assembly discuss about it and ratify the appointment. Are we there now? Now, away from the General Assembly to the Security Council. When we talk about the Security Council is twin-like. We have what we call the permanent members, and we have what we call the non-permanent members. Now, what do we call the permanent members? Overall, the Security Council has 15 members. We have the 5 Ps, namely vis-a-vis the United Nations the United States of America, Britain, France, the USSR known as Russia today. After the fall of the Russian government the Soviet Union in 1991, we now have Russia, okay, which has the largest community. Are we there? Do you understand now? After the Berlin Wall fell and also the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, we now have Russia replacing, though they are still the same community. Then we have China. Are we there? So apart from those 5 Ps, we have the non-10 permanent members. Now these non-permanent members are 10 in numbers, and they comprise of countries, different countries, 10 different countries, which we can equally say that they can be re-elected, but they cannot be immediately reappointed or selected rather. Now they use what? 2 years in their positions. So after 2 years, for example, should Nigeria be appointed as one of the Security Council members, the non-permanents, are we there now? After 2 years, we have to go and rest. Another country will fill our post. Then we may come back after the next 2 years, which is after the 3rd year. Okay, provided should we be nominated. I will tell them. So we should know that the Security Council is divided into two. There are 15 members, the 5 permanent members, and the non-10 permanent members. The 10 non-permanent members are always on seats for 2 years. I will tell you. Now let's talk about the ECOWAS. When we talk about the ECOWAS, the Economic